The Duke of Ashford arrived at 9:30 and was shown into the ballroom, where three sisters were already performing. The eldest was at the pianoforte. The middle one was reciting Racine in French. The youngest had been placed near the window with a small watercolor she had apparently just completed. Holding it at an angle that caught the candlelight, that he stood in the doorway for 11 seconds. Then he looked toward the corner near the curtain, where a young woman in a grey dress was holding an empty tray. She was not performing anything. That he accepted a glass of wine from a footman and went to find his hostess. The trouble had started, as it often did, with a book that was not where it was supposed to be. Isabella had moved the Horace 3 inches to the left on Tuesday afternoon, because the binding on the spine was cracking along the inner hinge and she had wanted the weight distributed differently. She had moved it back on Wednesday morning. She had moved it again on Thursday when she noticed the crack had not improved. And she had wedged a strip of folded paper along the lower board to keep the pressure even overnight. This was the kind of thing she did. This was also the kind of thing that left evidence. She was standing on the library ladder on the evening of the Ashford ball, restoring the Horace to its exact original position, when her aunt came in. Lady Ashworth did not look at the ladder. She looked at the apron pocket. "You've been sharpening pencils again," she said. Isabella did not answer. Answering the obvious had never helped. Her aunt reached up, not quite high enough to be comfortable, and extracted the pencil stub from the apron pocket with 2 fingers. As one might remove a small unpleasant object from a place it had no business being. She crossed to the fireplace and dropped it into the ash tray beside the grate. "You know where you are to stand tonight," her aunt said, "near the curtain, by the east window, and if anyone speaks to you directly, I answer briefly and do not elaborate." And if the Duke— her aunt paused. The pause had a particular quality Isabella had learned to identify over 7 years. It meant that the sentence being assembled was one her aunt had rehearsed. "If the Duke or any of his party addresses you about the library, you tell them that you assist with the cataloguing. Nothing more. You do not read Latin. You have a serviceable knowledge of the shelving system. That is all." "Yes, ma'am." Her aunt looked at her for a moment with the expression she wore when she was trying to determine whether Isabella was agreeing or merely producing the sounds of agreement. Isabella had become very good, over 7 years, at making the two indistinguishable. "Cornelia has the Virgil passage," her aunt said. "I expect she will be asked to demonstrate her classical education at some point during the evening. And I would like the transition to be smooth. You will not be in the room when that happens, that I understand." Her aunt left. Isabella stood on the ladder for a moment after the door closed. The library was very quiet in the way that libraries become quiet when the person who has just left has taken all the noise with her. She looked at the Horace. The crack along the hinge was no worse. The folded paper had helped. She climbed down. On her way past the large central table, she paused at the Virgil. Not Cornelius Virgil, which was a handsome modern edition purchased for the season and had not been opened until Isabella had written the passage in the margin in Cornelia's presence 3 weeks ago, coaching her through the pronunciation. This was the old Virgil, the one with the brown calfskin cover and the water stain on the lower board that no amount of careful treatment had entirely removed. She opened it to the frontispiece. The handwriting there was not hers. It was older than she was, older than the water stain. Written in the careful deliberate hand of someone who had wanted the words to last. The ink had faded to a pale brown, but the letters were still distinct. "Forsan e haec olim meminus juvabit," perhaps one day it will be a pleasure to remember even these things. She did not know who had written it. She had found it her 2nd week in this house, when she was 17 and still learning which rooms she was permitted to enter and which she was permitted only to clean. She had come back to it many times since. She did not come back to it for comfort. Exactly. She came back to it the way one returns to a thing that refuses to mean less than it means. She closed the book. She replaced it in its position on the lower shelf, 3rd from the left, where it had lived for what she estimated was at least 40 years. She straightened her apron. She went to find the grey dress. By the time she descended to the ballroom, her 3 cousins were already arranged. Cornelia at the pianoforte, Augusta reciting Racine near the mantelpiece, and Harriet by the window with the watercolor. Isabella found her place near the east curtain, accepted the empty tray a footman pressed into her hands without being asked, and stood, the ballroom filled. Isabella stood at 9:32, by the clock above the east doorway. The Duke of Ashford arrived that he was younger than she had expected from the way her aunt spoke of him, though she had known his age in the abstract the way one knows abstract things. He was perhaps 30. He was tall and wore dark colors and had the particular manner of a man who is deciding at every moment how long he intends to remain in a given room. That he stood in the doorway for a moment. Isabella watched him without appearing to watch him, which was a skill she had developed out of practical necessity. That he looked at Cornelia. He looked at Augusta. He looked at Harriet. He looked briefly toward the east curtain. She dropped her gaze to the tray. When she looked up again, he was speaking to her aunt. The Duke stayed the required interval. He was introduced to Cornelia, who played well. He was introduced to Augusta, who recited Racine correctly and with appropriate feeling. He was introduced to Harriet, who showed him the watercolor and named each of the flowers in it, which she had learned from the botanical print on the library wall. That he said the correct things about all of them. Lady Ashworth was pleased. Isabella, standing near the curtain with her empty tray, could tell that she was pleased by the angle of her shoulders and the specific warmth of her voice when she refilled the Duke's glass herself rather than signaling a footman, toward the end of the first hour. Someone asked about the library. This was the moment her aunt had been preparing for. Lord Pembury, an elderly acquaintance of her uncle's with a known interest in classical texts, had asked whether Lord Ashworth's collection was as impressive as reported. Cornelia has quite the scholarly interest in our collection, her aunt said smoothly. She has been making a particular study of Virgil this season. Cornelia. Perhaps you might tell Lord Pembury about the fourth book. Cornelia turned from the pianoforte with exactly the right expression of modest willingness. She had practiced this. Isabella watched the east window and listened to Cornelia recite the passage she had taught her. With the pronunciation she had corrected 4 times and the brief commentary she had written out in a fair hand on a card that had since been destroyed, Lord Pembury nodded appreciatively. The Duke said nothing. Then the Duke said, "The fourth book is generally considered the strongest. What does Miss Ashworth make of the second?" There was a small silence. Cornelia's composure was very good. Isabella had observed it for 7 years and she could see, because she knew where to look, the precise location where it developed a hairline fracture. It was in the left corner of the mouth, a slight tightening. Here it was. "The second is very fine," Cornelia said. "The fall of Troy is rendered with great power. It is." The Duke agreed. "Do you find Aeneas sympathetic in his departure from Dido?" "There are readers who find him cold." Another silence. "This one slightly longer. I think he does what he must," Cornelia said. It was a reasonable answer. It was also, Isabella noted, the answer of someone who has heard the question before but has not thought about it. Isabella looked at the window. Outside, the street was quiet. A carriage passed. She was aware, without looking, that the Duke had turned slightly in her direction. Not toward her. Exactly. In her direction. She did not move. "Aeneas follows the gods," Lord Pembury offered, coming to Cornelia's rescue in the way that elderly men often rescued young women in these situations. "One can hardly fault a man for following the gods. One can fault the gods," the Duke said mildly. This produced a general laugh. The tension dissolved. Cornelia smiled and the moment passed. Isabella exhaled. She was looking at the window when she felt it, rather than saw it. The particular quality of being observed. Not the ambient observation of a ballroom, which she was accustomed to and had learned to be invisible within. Something more deliberate. She turned her head very slightly. The Duke was not looking at her. He was speaking to Lord Pembury about something else entirely. But he had shifted his position such that the east curtain was now in his peripheral field, and she had the distinct and unsettling impression that this was not accidental. She looked back at the window. She told herself she was imagining it. Later, after the guests had thinned and her aunt had sent her to assist with the supper arrangement, she was carrying a stack of dessert plates through the corridor when she heard her aunt's voice from the adjacent room. carrying through the half-open door with the particular clarity that meant her aunt was not aware of being overheard. Seemed engaged by Cornelia, I thought. And then her uncle's voice, lower. He asked about the second book. Cornelia didn't know the second book. She gave a perfectly adequate answer. That he noticed. A pause. That he noticed the library as well, her uncle said. He asked me about the cataloging system. What did you tell him? That we have a system. That it is well maintained. A pause. He asked who maintains it. The plates were cold in Isabella's hands. She stood very still in the corridor. What did you say? Her aunt asked. That I said we had excellent staff. Silence. Isabella moved on down the corridor before she could hear anything further, because she had learned, in 7 years, that there was a precise moment at which staying became more dangerous than leaving. And she had learned to find it by feel. She set the plates down in the supper room. Her hands were steady. She had stood near the east curtain for 3 hours. She had said nothing to anyone. She had held an empty tray and watched the window and listened to Cornelia recite her Virgil passage with the pronunciation Isabella had corrected 4 times. She went back to her room at the top of the house by the back stair. She did not think, when she lay down in the dark, about the way the Duke had shifted his position near the curtain. She did not think about the question he had asked about Aeneas. Which was not a question about Aeneas but about whether a person could be forgiven for leaving when leaving was right. She did not think about these things because she had learned, at 17, that there was a category of things not worth thinking about. And she had lived safely inside that category for a long time. She thought instead about the Horace on the upper shelf. The crack along the hinge. Whether the folded paper had done enough. She was almost asleep when she remembered that she had not put the pencil stub back in her apron pocket. Because it was in the ash tray. The glove was a fiction, and not a particularly subtle one. That the Duke of Ashford had not left a glove at Lord Ashworth's house on the evening of the ball. He had checked both pockets in the carriage on the way home and found them occupied by the usual contents. A folded note from his secretary, a small brass key to his own library at Crestfield, and the Xenophon. That he had taken the Xenophon from the lower shelf of the Ashworth library during the 7 minutes he had spent alone in that room on the pretext of admiring the collection while Lord Ashworth went to find his wife. He was not in the habit of taking books from other people's shelves without asking. He was also not in the habit of finding marginalia like this in the libraries of men like Lord Ashworth, who collected books the way other men collected hunting prints, for the appearance of the thing. With no particular interest in the contents. The annotations were in pencil. They ran along the outer margin of the right-hand pages in a hand so small it might have been mistaken, at a casual glance, for a shadow in the paper. They were in Greek. Not transliterated Greek. Not the careful block letters of a student working through an exercise, but Greek written at the speed of thought. The way a person writes in a language they use rather than a language they are displaying. He had stood in the Ashworth library and read 3 pages of marginalia before he heard footsteps in the corridor and replaced the book on the shelf, took note of its exact position, and turned to admire a landscape painting above the fireplace. Then he had taken the book anyway, on his way out, because he was a thorough person and the painting had not been worth looking at. I in the carriage his mother had said, "Well, the eldest plays well," he said, "and the second recites adequately. The third paints flowers." His mother was silent in the way she was silent when she was waiting for him to say the thing he had not yet said. "There is a 4th young woman in that house," he said. "She was near the east curtain for the duration of the evening." "I know," his mother said. "She manages the library." He looked at her. "I asked Lady Ashworth while you were speaking with Lord Pemberley," his mother said. "She said the girl assists with the cataloguing. She called her a poor relation. She used the word assists in the way people use it when they mean something else entirely." She paused. "Her name is Miss Wren. Isabella Wren. Her father was a scholar of some kind. He died when she was teen." The Duke looked out at the dark street. "She knew the answer to the Aeneas question," he said. "She did not answer it. His mother said. "She did not." He returned the following afternoon under the pretense of the missing glove. Lord Ashworth was not at home. Lady Ashworth received him with the particular warmth of a woman who has invested considerably in a situation and intends to protect that investment from all unglees. "How very kind of you to call," she said. "I shall have the servants look at once. Please, come and sit." Cornelia was just about to. "I wonder," the Duke said, "if I might trouble someone to show me to the library while the glove is being searched for. I had meant to ask Lord Ashworth about a particular volume last evening and the opportunity slipped by." A brief hesitation. "Of course. I shall have. Miss Wren might show me. If she is not otherwise occupied," he said. "I would not like to take Cornelia from whatever she was engaged in." The hesitation this time was longer. He watched Lady Ashworth make a rapid set of calculations. He had seen faster and more complicated calculations in the House of Lords and was not troubled by the process, certainly. She said, "I shall send for her." Isabella came into the drawing room with the expression of a person who has been told very little and is making do. She curtsied correctly and said she would be happy to show his grace to the library. In the corridor she said nothing. He said nothing. She opened Th. E. library door, stood aside, and waited that he walked to the center of the room and stopped. The library was not large. Perhaps 2,000 volumes, floor to ceiling on 3 walls. With a rolling ladder on a brass rail and a central table of the kind used for laying out maps or oversized folios. The arrangement was, on first inspection, conventional, folio-sized books on the lower shelves, smaller volumes above. Standard bilanguage groupings with Latin on the east wall and Greek beside it. On second inspection it was not conventional at all. Within the bilanguage grouping there was a secondary organization by period. And within period a tertiary organization he had to look at for nearly a minute before he identified it, by condition. The most fragile volumes were on the middle shelves. Away from the damp of the floor and the drying effect of the upper air near the ceiling. On the lower shelves he found acid-free paper interleaved between volumes whose bindings were pressing against their neighbors. Someone had thought carefully about this library for a long time. He reached into his coat and took out the Xenophon. He set it on the central table. He turned it so that it faced her. She looked at the book. Then she looked at him. "The annotations are yours," he said. It was not a question. She was quiet for a moment. He waited. He was a patient person when the situation warranted it, and this situation warranted it. "Yes," she said. She had known, when Lady Ashworth sent for her, that it would be about the library. She had not known it would be about the Xenophon specifically, but she had understood since the evening of the ball that something had shifted in the arrangement she had lived inside for 7 years, and that shifts of this kind had consequences. And that the most probable consequence was unpleasant. She had not expected him to put the book on the table and push it toward her like evidence. She had not expected it to feel like relief. "Yes," she said. "They are mine." The Duke looked at her with the particular attention of a man who is accustomed to being lied to in careful and well-constructed ways and has recently encountered something that is not a lie. "How long have you been in this library?" 7 years, and before that? "My father's library." He had considerably fewer volumes, but he worked through most of them more than once. She paused. "He was a classicist." "Not a prominent one." "He published 2 papers on Thucydides that were not widely read. That I have read them," the Duke said. She looked at him. "The second one in particular," he said. "On the question of Thucydides' sources in the Melian dialogue. It was in the Classical Quarterly in 1803. I disagreed with the conclusion, but the argument was sound." She said nothing for a moment. The room was very quiet. That he would have been glad to hear that, she said. "The disagreement as much as the rest of it." The Duke moved to the east wall and looked at the Latin section. He pulled out a volume, looked at the spine, replaced it. He pulled out another. "Do you read everything in here?" "Not the law volumes. I find them," she considered, "procedural in a way that doesn't reward the time." "And the Greek?" "All of it. The Xenophon I find useful for thinking. The Herodotus I find useful for remembering that the world has always been larger and stranger than the part of it one can see from a given room." That he turned from the shelf. "And the Latin?" The Virgil I know well. The Horace I prefer. The Suetonius. She stopped. What about the Suetonius? I find his methods uncharitable. She said. He is interested in degradation. He notices what diminishes his subjects and calls it biography. There is something in that approach that seems to men it dishonest exactly. But incomplete. A man who only records what is contemptible in his subjects has decided in advance what he is going to find. She stopped again. She had said more than she had intended to say. She had said, in fact, more words in the last 2 minutes than she typically said to anyone outside of her cousin's lessons in an entire day. And she was aware of this the way one is aware of a door that has opened unexpectedly onto a room one thought was a wall. The Duke was looking at her with an expression she could not immediately categorize. That I agree about the Suetonius. He said. She waited. That I would add that he is also a poor stylist, the Duke said. His sentences are built for gossip. They have the structure of rumor. Yes. She said. Exactly that. There was a pause. It was not an uncomfortable pause. That was the unsettling thing about it. She looked at the table. The Xenophon was still there, open to the page where her annotations began, her handwriting very small along the margin. Miss Wren. The Duke said. May I ask you something directly? She considered this. You may ask. Does anyone in this house know you read Greek? The question was simple. She had been asked much more complicated questions in this house and had answered them all without difficulty. This one required a moment. Why uncle knows that I manage the library. She said. He attributes the organization to my father's training. He has not inquired more specifically than that. And your aunt? My aunt knows that I have some familiarity with the texts. Sufficient to coach my cousins when they require it. She paused. She believes this familiarity is limited. I have not corrected that belief. Why not? She looked at him. Your Grace, I have lived in this house for 7 years as a dependent. I have no income of my own, no property. And no connections independent of this family. The margin by which I am useful to my aunt is narrow, and it depends on my appearing to have slightly fewer capacities than I actually have. If I appeared to have more, I would become a threat to my cousin's presentation rather than an asset to it. And I would be in the street within the week. She said it without bitterness, in the tone she used for facts that had been facts for long enough that the feeling had gone out of them. I do not imagine this surprises you. He was quiet for a moment. No. He said. It does not surprise me. Then why ask? Because I wanted to hear you say it plainly. He said. And because I wanted to know whether you would. He looked at her steadily. You would. She did not know what to do with that, so she said nothing. That he picked up the Xenophon and held it for a moment. Then he placed it back on the table, not in her direction this time, but between them. Equidistant. Miss Wren, he said. I intend to call again. Not specifically in pursuit of my glove, which I should tell you I did not in fact leave here. He said this with complete composure. I intend to call again because I have not, this season, spoken with anyone who said a sentence worth hearing. And I find I am reluctant to stop now that I have started. She looked at the equidistant Xenophon. Something in her chest was doing something she had told it not to do years ago and which it appeared to have decided to do anyway. You have spoken with me for approximately 12 minutes. She said. That I know. You cannot determine the value of a person's conversation from 12 minutes. That I determined the value of your conversation from your annotation of Book 3, Chapter 4. He said. The spoken version is additional evidence. She was quiet. That I do not require you to respond to this now. He said. I am telling you because I think you are a person who makes better decisions with complete information. He picked up his hat from the chair where he had set it. I believe my glove has probably been found by now. That he went to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. The Thucydides p. Aper, he said. Your father's argument about the Melian dialogue. He was wrong about the conclusion, but I think now he may have been wrong in the right direction. I would like to discuss it sometime if you are willing, she said, because it was true and because she found, to her own surprise, that she was done with being incomplete. I think he was wrong in the right direction too. I told him so. He agreed with me but published the paper anyway because it was already written. The Duke looked at her for a moment with something that was not quite a smile but occupied the same territory, then he left. Isabella stood in the library for some time after she heard the front door close. The Xenophon was still on the table. She picked it up and held it for a moment, feeling the familiar weight of it. The slightly rough texture of the cover where the leather had dried and pulled a little along the lower board. Then she put it back in its place on the shelf. She stood at the shelf with her hand resting on the spine for a moment. The way she sometimes did with the Virgil, she thought about 12 minutes. She thought about Book 3, Chapter 4. She thought about her father's paper, which she had read in final proof the week before he sent it to the Quarterly. And the argument they had had over supper about whether he should revise the conclusion, which he had not, and the way he had looked at her across the table when he said, "You are almost certainly right, my dear." But being right and knowing what to do about it are two entirely different problems. She had not thought about that supper in some years. She took her hand from the spine of the Xenophon. She went to find her aunt. Lady Ashworth noticed the library door had been closed for 19 minutes. Abella knew this because her aunt told her so, in the corridor outside the library. Approximately 4 minutes after the Duke's carriage had pulled away from the front of the house. The timing suggested that her aunt had been watching from the drawing-room window and had begun moving toward the corridor before the wheels had fully stopped. 19 minutes. Her aunt said, "I had sent you to show him to the library. Not to conduct a private interview." He asked about the cataloging system. Isabella said. "I explained it. The cataloging system does not require 19 minutes to explain." His Grace had several questions. Her aunt looked at her with the expression she used when she was deciding how much she believed. Isabella had been looked at with this expression many times. She had learned to meet it with a face that gave nothing, which was different from a face that hid things. A face that hid things had tells. A face that gave nothing was simply a face. What did you discuss? Her aunt said, the organization of the collection. The condition of some of the older volumes. He expressed interest in the Latin section, and he mentioned a paper by my father. I confirmed that my father had published it. Her aunt was quiet. You discussed your father. He raised the subject. I answered briefly, Isabella. Her aunt's voice had dropped into its lower register. Which was the register she used when she wanted something to be understood as final. You are here because this family has been generous to you for 7 years. You are here because your uncle and I have provided for you out of charity when the law required nothing of us. You are a dependent. You are not a guest. You are not a companion. You are certainly not a suitable subject of interest for a man of the Duke's position, and if you have in any way presented yourself as such, either through conversation or through— she paused, selecting the word with care— through familiarity. You have done this family a serious injury. Isabella said, I understand that. I am glad. Her aunt straightened. The Duke will call again. He is interested in Cornelia. I want you out of the library before he arrives. And I want you to remain out of it for the duration of any call. You will instruct Harriet on the organization sufficiently for her to answer basic questions, and you will do so today, yes. Ma'am. Her aunt reached to her own belt. The library key was on a small brass ring beside her household keys, where it had lived since the library had been part of the house she ran. She unfastened it from the ring, then she refastened it. I will keep the library key myself for the present, she said. If any of the girls need access, they will come to me. She walked away down the corridor, the keys making their small sound against her dress. Isabella stood at the library door for a moment. Through the wood she could feel, or imagined she could feel, the particular silence of the room on the other side. The Horace on the upper shelf. The Virgil on the lower. The Xenophon back in its place. The cover slightly worn along the lower board. She put her hand flat against the door, then she went to find Harriet and teach her the difference between the Latin and the Greek sections, which Harriet would not remember in the morning but which would be, for tonight, sufficient. She did not sleep well. This was not unusual. She had not slept well for most of 7 years. And she had developed a set of habits to manage the hours between 2 and 4 in the morning when the house was quiet and the things she did not permit herself to think about during the day became harder to keep at a distance. Tonight the thoughts had a new shape, she had said, in the library. More than she had said to any person outside of a tutoring arrangement in 7 years. She had said it without meaning to say it, or rather, she had meant to say it and had been surprised to find that the meaning was still there, intact. After so long of not being used. She had not known she still had opinions about Suetonius. She had not known she still had the reflex of honesty. She had told her father's paper was wrong in the right direction. She had not told anyone that. She had thought it many times. In the specific wordless way one thinks things one has no one to say them to, and the thought had lived in her without being spoken for 6 years. And in 12 minutes it had come out of her mouth as naturally as if she had just thought of it. This alarmed her, not the thought itself. The ease of it. The way the door had opened and she had walked through it without noticing she was walking until she was already on the other side. She lay in the dark and thought about her aunt's keys. She thought about the Xenophon on the shelf. About what it meant that he had taken it and brought it back. About a man who disagreed with her father's Thucydides paper and had remembered it after 11 years, she thought about her father. Which she tried not to do too often because it was not productive. She thought about the week before he died, which she tried never to think about at all. There had been a clerk. His name had been Mr. Foss, and he had been her father's only employee for the last 3 years. A thin young man who coughed in winter and who had, in the last week of her father's life, copied out a document at her father's instruction and pressed it into Isabella's hand on a Thursday morning with the instruction that she should keep it somewhere her aunt would not find it. She had kept it in the lining of her winter coat, sewn into the hem with small stitches. For 7 years, she had not looked at it in 3 years. She had not looked at it because looking at it made her think about what to do with it, and she had not known what to do with it. And not knowing had been worse than not looking. She turned onto her side in the dark. The coat was in the chest at the foot of her bed, under the summer linens. The document was in the hem. She thought about a man who said, "I find I am reluctant to stop now that I have started." She got up. She lit the candle on her bedside table. She opened the chest de mar. Padet had been the Ashford family's solicitor for 26 years. And in that time he had seen most of the ways that money and families combine to produce unhappiness. He had developed, as a result, a very still face and a very precise way of laying documents on a table. He laid them now in 3 columns, left, center, right, left column. A certified copy of a trust deed, dated 1801, establishing an annuity of £200 per annum in the name of one Isabella Catherine Wren, daughter of Robert Henry Wren and Mary Ashworth Wren, to be administered by a trustee of the family's appointment until Miss Wren reached the age of 21, and thereafter to be paid directly to her at Michaelmas and Lady Day each year. Center column, quarterly payment records from the trust account, covering the period from Michaelmas 1808 through Lady Day 1815. Each payment duly received. Each receipt signed. Right column, the signatures on those receipts. None of them were Isabella's. The Duke sat to the right of the table. Isabella sat directly in front of it. Mr. Padet stood to the left. Which was where he always stood, because standing to the left allowed him to observe the faces of the people on the right without appearing to do so. Isabella had been sitting very still since she came in. She had sat still in the carriage he had sent his own, with his mother's coachman, and she had sat still in the waiting room, and she had sat still when he introduced her to Mr. Padet, and she had sat still when the documents came out. She was sitting still now, looking at the center column. He watched her read. She read the way people read when they already know what they are going to find and are confirming it rather than discovering it. Not shock. Something older than shock, Miss Wren, Mr. Padet said. The trust was established by your mother's family in 1801. Prior to your parents' marriage. It was set up specifically to ensure that the income could not be absorbed into your father's estate. It would have survived your father's death intact. He paused. It has survived it intact. The principal has not been touched. The annuity payments have been made every quarter without interruption. Isabella looked at the right column. At the signatures "My uncle," she said, "Lord Ashworth, signing as de facto trustee." Mr. Pedet's voice was entirely without inflection, which was a skill the Duke had come to recognize as a form of precision. There is no formal deed of trusteeship on record. He appears to have presented himself to the trust administrators as your guardian and been accepted as such. The payments were remitted to the estate account, the household AC. Count. Isabella said. She said it in the tone of someone who has just understood a set of numbers they have been looking at for years. The quarterly household accounts. I manage those. I have managed them for 6 years. She was quiet for a moment. It was always there. In the income column. Quarterly. ITH. Audit was rental income from the Derbyshire property. The Duke said nothing. He had not said anything since the documents were laid out, and he did not intend to say anything until she had finished. £200 per annum. She said, "Yes, for 7 years, yes." She was quiet again. The room was very quiet. Outside, Lincoln's Inn Fields had its usual mid-morning sounds, a cart, voices at a distance, a door somewhere. "Miss Wren," Mr. Pedet said. "I would like to ask you a question. If I may." She looked at him. "Do you have any documentation that establishes your identity in connection with this trust? A copy of the deed, a letter referencing the arrangement, anything of that nature?" Isabella reached into the small bag she carried. She removed from it a winter glove, her own. Worn at the thumb, too warm for May, and turned it inside out. From the lining, where the hem had been carefully unstitched and restitched with smaller stitches than the original, she removed a folded piece of paper. She unfolded it on the table. It was a copy. The Duke could see that at a glance the handwriting was not a solicitor's hand, it was the hand of a young man writing quickly and carefully at someone's instruction. But the text was precise and complete. The relevant clauses of the trust deed, the annuity amount, the conditions of payment, and at the bottom, witnessed by one Thomas Foss, clerk, and dated in the last week of March 1808, a note in a different Hendon older hand, shakier, the hand of a man who was ill, that read: "For Isabella. Keep this where your aunt cannot find it. Your mother meant this for you. So did I, Demar." Pedet looked at the document for a long time. He looked at it with the stillness of a man who has made a professional study of documents and is recognizing, in this one, something that has no technical legal term but that he has seen before in 30 years of practice. The last organized act of a man who knew he was dying and knew exactly what was going to happen to his daughter afterward and could do very little about it except this. "Your father arranged this copy," Mr. Pedet said, "the week before he died." Isabella said. "His clerk brought it to me on a Thursday. He told me to keep it somewhere safe, and you kept it in the hem of my winter coat. I re-sewed it every year when I aired the coat." She paused. "I was not certain it would be useful. I was not certain anyone would believe it over my aunt's road. But my father asked me to keep it, and I kept it in." Pedet was quiet for a moment. "Miss Wren," he said, "there is at least one person in this room who will believe it over your aunt's word. There are shortly going to be several more." He set the copy beside the certified trust deed and placed them precisely parallel. "These are identical in all material particulars. The copy, combined with the payment records and the absence of any receipt in your hand, constitutes a clear record of misappropriation." He looked at her over the documents. "Do you wish me to proceed?" Isabella looked at the table. At the two documents side by side, the one her father's dying clerk had pressed into her hands on a Thursday morning and the one Mr. Pedet had obtained from the trust registry, saying the same thing in different handwriting. Saying it together now for the first time. She had carried the coat hem for 7 years. She had not known, until she opened it at 2 in the morning by candlelight the night before, that the document inside was not just the copy of a clause but the copy of an entire deed. She had not known the annuity was £200. She had thought, from the fragment she had read at 17, that it was less. She had not unfolded it fully in 3 years because unfolding it fully had made her think about what to do. she thought about her uncle's signature on 28 quarterly receipts, she thought about the household account she had kept for 6 years. The rental income from the Derbyshire property that appeared every quarter, regular as weather, she thought about her aunt's keys. Yes, she said. Please proceed, Demar. Padette nodded once. With the brief precise nod of a man confirming a transaction. He began gathering the documents into their correct order, the Duke said, quietly, from his position to the right of the table. Miss Wren. There is one other matter. She looked at him. Why mother's house in Grosvenor Street has a guest room that has been prepared since last week. You will not be able to remain in Lord Ashworth's house once the summons is served. If you are willing. My mother would like you to come to her directly from here. Isabella was quiet. She is not well, he said. She is better than she was in March. But she is not well. She has asked specifically. He paused. She said to tell you that she has a first edition Gibbon she has been meaning to read for 10 years and has been unable to because the print is small and it makes her eyes ache. And she would find it useful to have someone read it to her. Isabella looked at him for a moment. That is a very transparent pretext, she said. Yes. He said. She intended it to be. She said a transparent pretext was more respectful than a complicated one because it told you what she actually wanted without making you work for it. She was quiet again. Out the window. Lincoln's Inn Fields was doing its ordinary business in the ordinary morning light. A woman walked past with a basket. A clerk from one of the other offices crossed the square at a pace that suggested he was late. She thought about the guest room. She thought about Grosvenor Street. She thought abo. Ut 7 years of the back stair and the apron pocket and the grey dress and the east curtain. She thought about her father's handwriting at the bottom of the copy. Your mother meant this for you. So did I. Tell her, Isabella said, that I am very fond of Gibbon Damar. Padette, who had been organizing documents and pretending not to listen, permitted himself a very small adjustment of expression that was not quite a smile and was entirely professional. The Duke said, good. He said it simply. In the way of a man who has been hoping for a particular answer and is not going to make more of it than it is, because making more of it would be a kind of pressure and he was not, in this matter, willing to apply pressure. Isabella looked back at the documents on the table. At her father's handwriting at the bottom of the copy, slightly shaky. The letters larger than his usual hand because his hands had been unsteady in the last weeks. For Isabella, she had kept it for 7 years without knowing what she was keeping it for. She understood now that she had been keeping it for this, a table in Lincoln's Inn Fields. A solicitor with a still face and precise hands. And 2 documents saying the same thing side by side. She folded her hands in her lap. She waited for Mr. Padette to tell her what happened next. The summons was prepared on a Wednesday. It would be served on a Friday. Demar. Padette had explained this to Isabella in the careful sequential way he explained everything, as though information delivered out of order was information wasted. Wednesday for preparation. Thursday for the copy to be filed at Chancery. Friday for service, by a clerk he trusted. At 11 in the morning, when Lord Ashworth was most likely to be at home and least likely to be in a position to make the matter complicated, Isabella had 2 days. She spent the first of them at Grosvenor Street, in a room that was neither large nor small, with a window that faced east and a writing desk that faced the window. The desk had been cleared except for a standish and a small stack of blank paper, which she understood, without being told, was an invitation rather than an expectation. She sat at it for some time without writing anything. The house was quiet in a way that Lord Ashworth's house had never been quiet. In Lord Ashworth's house the quiet was managed. It was the quiet of a place where noise had been suppressed rather than the quiet of a place where there was simply nothing requiring noise. Here the quiet was ordinary. A clock. A fire settling. Outside. Grosvenor Street going about its business. She was not used to ordinary quiet. In the afternoon the Duchess sent for her. The Duchess of Ashford was smaller than Isabella had expected, and older. And considerably more alert. She was in a chair by the fire in her sitting room with a shawl across her knees and the expression of a woman who has been ill long enough to have stopped finding it interesting and has moved on to other things. Sit down, she said. Before Isabella had finished her curtsy. I dislike watching people curtsy. It takes too long and tells me nothing useful about them. Isabella Satem son tells me you find Suetonius uncharitable. The Duchess said that I do, that so do I. I find him prurient. Which is related but not identical. She looked at Isabella with the direct gaze of someone who has decided that at her age and in her condition, the oblique approach is not worth the time. He also tells me you have been in that house for 7 years. Yes, doing what? Managing the library. Tutoring my cousins in Latin and some Greek. Keeping the household accounts, for which you were paid, for which I was housed and fed. The Duchess was quiet for a moment. I see. She looked at the fire. My son has not told me what he intends to do about this beyond the legal matter, which I understand is being handled. I know what he hopes to do. He has not said it to me in words because he is under the impression that announcing a thing before it is settled is a form of presumption. She paused. He is generally right about that. In this case I think he is being overcautious. But I have learned not to push him on procedural points. Isabella did not say anything that I am telling you this, the Duchess said, because I think you are a person who does better with complete information. Ellis said the same thing about you. Which suggests you made an impression. She picked up the book from the small table beside her chair. It was a Gibbon, first volume, the print very small. Will you read to me? Isabella read to her for 2 hours. The Duchess interrupted twice. Once to disagree with Gibbon's account of a particular emperor, and once to ask Isabella what she thought of the prose style, which Isabella described as magnificent and somewhat in love with itself, which made the Duchess laugh a short, genuine laugh. The laugh of a woman who has not laughed at something in several weeks and is glad to find she still can. When Isabella rose to go, the Duchess held out her hand. Isabella took it. You have been in that house too long, the Duchess said. Yes. Isabella said. I know, you will not go back to it, not after Friday. Good. She released Isabella's hand. Come back tomorrow. We are barely into the first volume. On Thursday morning. A letter arrived at Grosvenor Street from Lord Ashworth's house. It was addressed to Isabella in her aunt's handwriting, which meant her aunt had identified where she was. Which meant either that she had been watching from a window on the day Isabella left or that she had asked questions of the right servants. Both were consistent with her aunt's methods. Isabella opened it at the breakfast table, alone. Because the Duke was at his solicitor's and the Duchess did not come down to breakfast, the letter was short. It said that Isabella had behaved with considerable ingratitude toward a family that had sheltered her for 7 years. It said that Isabella's behavior had caused distress to her cousins, who were fond of her. It said that whatever misunderstanding had led Isabella to take the advice of persons who did not have the family's interests at heart, there was still time to correct it quietly. And that if Isabella returned to Mount Street by Friday morning no further action would be necessary. It did not mention the trust. It did not mention the annuity. It did not mention 28 quarterly receipts bearing Lord Ashworth's signature. Isabella folded the letter. She held it for a moment. And, then she set it beside her plate and finished her breakfast. She wrote a reply that said, Dear Aunt, I am well. Isabella. She sealed it and gave it to the footman for the afternoon post, because she was not a person who left letters unanswered. And because I am well was both true and complete, she went upstairs to read the second chapter of Gibbon to the Duchess, who was waiting. The Countess of Harwood's literary evening was held on the last Thursday of every month from October through June. In the long drawing room of her house in Berkeley Square, and it was considered by most of its regular attendees to be the most interesting event on the London calendar that did not involve dancing. This was partly because the Countess had excellent taste in both books and people, and partly because she had a gift for arranging a room such that the interesting people ended up near each other by what appeared to be accident. The Duke had attended most of these evenings since inheriting the title. He attended them because the Countess was his father's sister and because she reliably provided the kind of conversation that made the rest of the social season bearable. By contrast, that he had asked her, 2 days ago, to add a name to the evening's invitation. She had looked at him when he asked. She had the family eyes, dark, direct, Slightly amused by most things, and she used them now with the precision of a woman who has known her nephew since he was 4 years old and has a very accurate picture of what he looks like when something matters to him. Miss Wren. She said, she is staying with my mother. My mother is not well enough to come out in the evening, and Miss Wren has been. He paused, selecting the word carefully, confined to a narrow social situation for some years. I thought the evening might be useful to her. Useful? The Countess said, broadening. Ellis, the Countess said. I have been running these evenings for 11 years. I know when a young man asks me to invite a young woman because he thinks an evening of literary conversation will be broadening for her, and I know when he is asking me something else. You may have the straightforward version of my answer, which is yes, and you may have the additional version, which is that I have met Miss Wren once at your mother's house and found her extremely sensible and very well read, and I would have invited her regardless. The Duke said, thank you, don't thank me. The Countess said, bring her on Thursday and make sure she knows that at my evenings people are expected to have opinions. Isabella wore the grey dress. She had considered the question of what to wear with more attention than she had given to clothing in 7 years. Which was to say approximately 4 minutes, and had concluded that she did not have anything else suitable, and that the grey dress was, at this point, a garment with a history that she was not inclined to abandon simply because she had access to a larger wardrobe mirror than usual. The Countess received her in the hall with a handshake rather than the customary greeting, which Isabella understood immediately as a statement about the kind of evening this was going to be. Miss Wren. The Countess said, I am told you find Suetonius uncharitable. I find him dishonest. I think we will get along. The long drawing room held perhaps 30 people. They were arranged in the informal clusters of a gathering where the host has spent some thought on placement and then rearranged it times. Isabella was placed, by a process that appeared entirely natural, in the group nearest the fireplace, which contained a classical historian from Cambridge, a woman who had published a translation of Plutarch under her husband's name, and an elderly bishop who turned out to have strong opinions about the accuracy of Livy. She talked for 2 hours. She talked about Livy and about Thucydides and about her father's paper, which the Cambridge historian had read and disagreed with in a way that was interesting rather than dismissive. And she talked about the organization of the Ashworth Library, which the Plutarch translator found professionally fascinating, and she talked about the Xenophon Marginalia, which she had been thinking about for weeks and had not had anyone to think about with. At some point during the second hour she noticed that she had stopped monitoring the room. This was significant. She had monitored rooms for 7 years not as a social skill but as a survival mechanism, tracking the location of her aunt, the temperature of conversations, the earliest possible moment at which her presence would no longer be required. She had done it so automatically that she had stopped noticing she was doing it. The way one stops noticing the sound of a clock after long enough. She had stopped. She was simply in a room, talking about Thucydides. Toward the end of the evening the Duke appeared at the edge of her group. He had been on the other side of the room for most of the evening, talking to the Countess and a small man with ink stains on his fingers who turned out to be a publisher. He did not insert himself into the conversation. He stood at the edge of it, in the manner of someone who has arrived at the end of a piece of music and is waiting for it to finish before doing anything else. Lord Pembury, the elderly classical scholar who had been present at the Ashworth ball and who was apparently a regular at these evenings, said to Isabella, you made a remark earlier about Thucydides and the structure of rumor that I found very striking. I wonder if you would expand on it. She expanded on it. She was aware, as she did, that the Duke was listening. She was aware, and then she was not aware, because the thought was interesting enough to require her full attention, and she had learned, in 2 hours, that this was a room where that was permitted. When the group dispersed she found herself standing near the fireplace with the Duke, both of them holding cups that had been empty for some time. That he said, Lord Pembury is going to ask you to write something. That he mentioned it. What did you say? I said I would think about it. She looked at the cup. I have not written anything intended to be read by another person since I was 17. Your marginalia are intended to be read, he said. You write them too clearly for private use. She looked at him. A person writing purely for themselves writes at the speed of thought, he said. The hand doesn't bother with legibility. Yours are legible. You were writing for a reader you hadn't met yet, she thought about the Xenophon. The small careful letters along the margin, she thought about writing at the speed of thought versus writing for a reader she hadn't met. She thought. About 17 years old in her father's library, making notes in the margins of books she was allowed to write in, and whether she had been writing for herself or for someone else, she thought, though she did not say this. Or perhaps I was writing for a version of myself that would eventually be somewhere a reader could find them, she said. That is a more charitable interpretation than the evidence supports. It's the accurate one, he said. Outside, Berkeley Square was quiet. The fire had burned down to a steady, patient heat. Around them the room was emptying in the gradual way of a good evening ending reluctantly, in stages, with people stopping at the door to finish one more sentence that he said, quietly, Miss Wren. Are you all right? The question was simple. It was also, she realized, the first time in 7 years that anyone had asked it and meant, not are you performing adequately or are you causing difficulty, but simply are you all right. She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. That I think, she said, that I am in the process of becoming all right. I am not certain I have arrived yet. That he said nothing. He did not try to improve on this or correct it or reassure her that she was further along than she thought. He simply received it. Which was exactly the right thing to do. They stood for a moment longer by the fire, then the Countess materialized at Isabella's elbow with the efficient grace of a woman who has been managing her drawing room for 11 years and said it was time for the carriages. And the evening ended the way good evenings end, too soon, and leaving something unfinished that you find yourself looking forward to finishing. The summons was served on Friday at 11, as Mr. Pedet had arranged. Isabella was not present for the serving of it. She was at Grosvenor Street, in the east-facing room, at the writing desk, where she had been sitting since 7 in the morning with a piece of paper in front of her that she had been trying to begin for 3 days. She was not thinking about Lord Ashworth's face when the clerk arrived. She was thinking about the opening sentence of an argument about Thucydides and the structure of reported speech in the Melian dialogue that Lord Pembury had asked her to write and that she had been finding, to her considerable surprise, that she wanted to write. She wrote the first sentence at 10:30 that she did not know, while she was writing it, that at approximately the same moment a clerk from Lincoln's Inn was handing a document to Lord Ashworth's butler in the entrance hall of the house in Mount Street, or that Lord Ashworth was reading it 15 minutes later in his study with the door closed. Or that Lady Ashworth was informed at noon and spent the subsequent 2 hours writing letters and burning them. She found out later, in fragments, from the Countess, who had her own sources. What she knew directly was this: on Saturday morning the Countess' literary evening became, by a process she did not entirely understand, the occasion for a dinner. The dinner was at the Countess' house in Berkeley Square. It was not large, 14 people, but it included Lord Pembury, the Cambridge historian, 3 members of the Duke's reforming set in the Lords, and, arriving late with her husband and her 3 daughters in new dresses, Lady Ashworth. Isabella understood, when she saw her aunt in the doorway of the Countess' dining room, that this had been arranged, not the dinner. The dinner was the Countess' ordinary hospitality. What had been arranged was the guest list, and who would be seated where, and the fact that Isabella was already in the room when her aunt arrived. She was standing near the window with Lord Pembury, discussing whether Thucydides' account of the Melian dialogue could be trusted as a verbatim record or whether it was a literary reconstruction. She had a glass of wine she had not drunk. Lord Pembury had his hands clasped behind his back and was arguing the verbatim position with the enthusiasm of a man who has held an opinion for 40 years and enjoys defending it. She saw her aunt see her. She watched the calculation happen. It was a rapid calculation. Her aunt was a rapid calculator, and it covered, she estimated, the following questions: whether Isabella's presence was an accident or an arrangement, whether the Duke was in the room, where the Duke's aunt was standing, and what the correct response was to finding one's dependent niece in a wine glass and an academic argument at a dinner at one of the most significant houses of the season. Her aunt made her decision. She smiled. She crossed the room. Isabella, my dear, she said, warmly, with the warmth of a woman who has decided that the correct posture is generous surprise. How well you look. Lady Harwood is so very kind to include you. Isabella looked at her aunt, she thought, quite clearly and without drama. About the pencil stub in the ashtray. About the library key on the belt. About 28 quarterly receipts signed in her uncle's hand. About the winter coat in the chest at the foot of her bed and the document sewn into the hem. She thought about 7 years of making her face give nothing to sh. E said, in her ordinary voice, which was not raised and did not need to be, because the room had developed the specific quality of quiet that rooms develop when two people are speaking and the people nearby have decided to listen. You have drawn my father's annuity for 7 years. Aunt. You have signed the receipts yourself. You have never given me a shilling of it. The room was very quiet, her aunt's smile remained in position. It was a very good smile. She had been practicing it for 20 years and it held under considerable pressure. My dear. I don't know what you have been told, but there has been a great deal of misunderstanding about the household arrangements. The quarterly payment records are at Mr. Padette's office. Isabella said. He has a certified copy of the trust deed and 28 receipts signed by Lord Ashworth. He also has a copy of the deed made by my father's clerk in the last week of my father's life, which my father gave me with the instruction to keep it somewhere safe. She paused for one beat. I kept it for 7 years. I kept it in the hem of my winter coat. Cornelia, standing 2 steps behind her mother, made a small sound that it was not much of a sound. It was the kind of sound a person makes when they have been holding a particular understanding of their own life and have just heard something that requires that understanding to be revised. And the revision is happening faster than expected, Lady Ashworth said, still in the warm drawing-room voice, though it had developed a quality now like a clock that is still running but has begun to lose time. Isabella, you are overwrought. This is not the place. I am not overwrought. Isabella said. I am telling you the facts of the matter in the place where you chose to speak to me. You may say what you like of me to this room. I think you will find it does not go the direction you intend. From the far end of the room, where she had been standing with a small group near the fireplace, the Countess of Harwood said, in the carrying voice of a woman who has managed difficult moments in her drawing-room for 11 years, Lady Ashworth. I think perhaps the small sitting-room would be more comfortable for a private conversation. Shall I have someone show you? It was not a question. It had the form of a question and the function of a direction. And it was delivered with the particular authority of a woman in her own house who has decided that a thing is over. Lady Ashworth stood for a moment. She was, Isabella knew, a clever woman. She was clever enough to see all of it at once, the Countess' voice, the room's silence. The Duke at the edge of the group near the door who had not spoken and did not need to, the 28 receipts at Mr. Padette's office, the document in the winter coat hem, and the fact that her own niece had just said, in front of 14 people including 3 lords and Lord Pembury of the Classical Quarterly, that she had kept a piece of evidence for 7 years and had been waiting for a place to put it. She was also clever enough to know that cleverness, at this particular moment, was not going to be sufficient. She said, in a voice that was still controlled, that was still recognizably her voice, but that had lost the warmth completely. I see. She turned. She walked to the door. She said something to her husband in the corridor. Too quietly to hear. The 3 daughters followed. Cornelia last at the door. Cornelia stopped. She turned and looked at Isabella across the length of the room. She did not say anything. She stood for a moment with the expression of a woman who has understood something she is not yet able to put into words. Then she nodded, once. A small precise nod, and went. The Countess moved back into the center of the room with the unhurried ease of a skilled conductor resuming a piece after an interruption. Lord Pembury, she said, I believe you were telling Miss Wren that she was wrong about Thucydides. That I was, Lord Pembury said, with the equanimity of a man who has survived 40 years of academic argument and found domestic drama considerably less interesting. Miss Wren, you were saying. Isabella looked at her wine-glass. Her hand was steady. She had expected it not to be steady, and she found it was. Which told her something about 7 years of practice that she had not entirely accounted for. She said, I was saying that the Melian dialogue cannot be verbatim because no one was taking notes. Thucydides reconstructed it from memory and from the accounts of survivors. And the question is not whether it is accurate to the words but whether it is accurate to the argument. I think it is. I think the argument is too uncomfortable to have been invented, Lord Pembury said, in the tone of a man who has been given something to push against. And the conversation resumed. The Duke appeared at Isabella's left side somewhere in the course of the next 10 minutes. He did not address the previous scene. He listened to the argument about Thucydides for a while and then said, to Lord Pembury, I think Miss Wren is right about the reconstruction. An invented dialogue would have been more flattering to Athens. Lord Pembury said this was a fair point and he was revising his position. Isabella did not look at the Duke. She was watching Lord Pembury revise his position, which was interesting on its own terms, but she was aware of him beside her, in the way she had become aware of him over the past weeks, as a constant in the room, something that did not require monitoring because it was not a threat. And the absence of that monitoring had opened up a quality of attention she had forgotten she possessed. Later, going to dinner. He offered her his arm, she took it. She had never taken a man's arm going into dinner. Her place at Lord Ashworth's table had not included going into dinner on anyone's arm. She had not expected the small, ordinary, specific weight of its sense of being placed, being accompanied. Being the person that a person was walking in with to feel the way it felt. She did not say anything about this. They went into dinner. After dinner, the Countess arranged the room with her usual efficiency for the second part of the evening, which involved a reading from a new translation of Pindar that the ink-stained publisher had brought, and then the gradual and pleasant dissolution of the company over the next hour. Isabella was standing near the window at the far end of the long room, looking at Berkeley Square in the dark. When the Duke came to stand beside her, she had expected this, in the way she had learned to expect things that were approaching, not by worrying about them but by simply noting their direction. That he said, "May I speak with you?" She said, "Yes, not here," he said. "The library. If you don't mind." "My aunt has no objection." The Countess' library was small and smelled of beeswax and old paper and, faintly, of the particular dust that accumulates in a collection that is used rather than displayed. 2 lamps had been left burning, which meant the Countess had anticipated this conversation or had left them burning for other reasons and either way had not considered it her business to intervene. Isabella stood in the center of the room. The Duke stood near the desk. He had his hands behind his back. In the way he stood when he was organizing what he wanted to say, she waited. That he said, "I asked my mother's permission 3 weeks ago. She gave it. I asked Mr. Pedet's advice yesterday. He said the timing was mine to judge." He paused. "I am asking you now," she said. "Ask that," he said. "Will you marry me?" He said it in his ordinary voice, which was not dramatic and did not ask the question to be more than it was. It was a serious question asked seriously, without decoration. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about the east-facing room at Grosvenor Street, the blank paper, the first sentence she had written this morning. She thought about dinner, and his arm, and the specific ordinary weight of being accompanied. She thought about Lord Pembury revising his position and the Countess' voice closing the scene in the dining room and the Cambridge historian saying her father's paper was wrong in an interesting direction. She thought about the Xenophon on the table between them in the Ashworth library, 3 weeks ago, placed equidistant. She said, "Before I answer, may I say something, please?" He said, "You have not, in the weeks since the ball, asked me to dress differently for any occasion I attended with you. You have not suggested I moderate my opinions for any room I was in. You did not tell me what to say to my aunt this evening or how to say it. You did not tell Mr. Pedet what I should decide about the trust." She looked at him. "You have offered me options and left the decision to me each time. I want you to know that I have noticed that, because I think it is not a small thing and I do not think it was accidental." He said. "It was not accidental that I know." She was quiet a moment. "I am saying it because I want you to know that it is the reason I am going to say yes. And not other reasons that might appear to be reasons but are not. Not because you have a title or because you helped me with the legal matter or because your mother has been kind to me." She paused. "Those are all things I am grateful for. They are not the reason." "What is the reason?" He said. She said, Because you are the first person in 7 years who has asked me what I think and then waited to hear what I actually think. Because when I said something about Suetonius in a library you had no reason to believe I would be honest in. You did not ask me to say it more politely. Because when I told you about the trust in a garden you had no reason to come to, you did not tell me what to do about it. Because she stopped. She started again. Because when I said I was in the process of becoming all right and had not arrived yet. You did not tell me I was wrong. You just stayed there. He was very still, she said. Those are the reasons. Yes, that he moved from the desk. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and removed something and placed it on the small table beside her. It was the Xenophon. She looked at it. That I have been carrying it since the afternoon I found it. He said. I intended to return it properly at some point. I find that this is the point. She picked it up. The cover was familiar under her hands, the slightly rough texture where the leather had dried along the lower board, the weight of it. The way it fell open at the most read pages as a well-used book does. She held it for a moment. She said, you took this from my uncle's shelf. That I did. That is a form of theft. That it is. He said. I justify it on the grounds that the annotations were yours and the book was being used as a shelf ornament and I was the more appropriate custodian. He paused. This justification is not legally sound. No, she said. It isn't. She was looking at the book and not at him. And she was smiling, which was something she had done rarely enough in the past 7 years that she was still occasionally surprised to find her face doing it. She opened it to Book 3. Chapter 4. Her annotations ran along the margin in their small careful hand. She had written them over the course of 3 years, a sentence here and a correction there, the way a conversation accumulates. She closed it. She said. I want to write the Thucydides piece for Lord Pembury. I know, and I would like, when we go to Crestfield, to work on the library catalogue. Your steward wrote to Mr. Pedet that the collection has not been properly catalogued since 1790. He is correct. It is in considerable disorder. I would like to address the disorder. I would like you to. He said. I have been meaning to address it for 3 years and have not had the right person for the work. She looked at him. He was not smiling with his mouth. He was doing the thing she had learned to read in the past weeks, where the corners of his eyes adjusted very slightly. Which meant the same thing, she said, we should go back in. Your aunt will be reorganizing the room. She will. He said. She reorganizes the room approximately every 20 minutes when she is pleased about something. It gives her something to do with her hands. They went to the door. He opened it. In the corridor the sounds of the drawing room reached them, voices. The distant sound of the publisher beginning the Pindar reading. The Countess laughed. At the door she stopped. She said, the Xenophon. That he said, keep it. She looked at the book in her hands. At her own handwriting in the margins, very small, written for a reader she hadn't met yet, she said. All right. They went back into the drawing room. The Countess looked at them from across the room with the expression of a woman who has managed her drawing room for 11 years and knows when something has been settled. And turned back to her guests without remarking on it. Isabella stood at the edge of the Pindar reading and listened. The translation was good. The publisher read well. With the unshowy confidence of a man who loves language and does not need to perform that love for an audience, she held the Xenophon at her side. She thought about Crestfield. About a library in disorder that had not been properly catalogued since 1790. About 25 years of accumulated books waiting for someone to read them, about a writing desk with a window. About a first sentence, about the particular quality of a room where nothing required monitoring. She listened to the Pindar. The fire settled. Outside, Berkeley Square was quiet and dark and entirely ordinary. In the way that things are ordinary when they are also exactly right. The settlement meeting was held on a Tuesday, in Mr. Pedet's office. At 10 in the morning, Lord Ashworth arrived with his own solicitor. A man named Grieve, who had the look of someone who had read the documents over the weekend and had spent Sunday forming an opinion he did not enjoy. They sat on one side of the long table. Mr. Pedet sat on the other. Isabella sat beside Mr. Pedet, which was where he had placed her chair. Without asking whether she wished to be present. Because he had assumed correctly that she did, the Duke was not in the room. He had offered to be present and she had said she did not think it was necessary. He had accepted this without revision. Lord Ashworth looked older than she remembered. She had last seen him 9 days ago. Across a dinner table. In the ordinary way of a household that functioned as a unit and did not examine its own functioning. He had the expression of a man who has been told clearly what his position is and has spent several days hoping the clarity was mistaken and has arrived at a meeting with the understanding that it was not that he did not look at her directly. She noted this without particular feeling. Demar. Grieve said that Lord Ashworth wished to express that any irregularities in the administration of the trust had arisen from a misunderstanding of his obligations as de facto guardian. And that he was prepared to make good any shortfall in payments to Miss Wren's account as a gesture of goodwill. Mr. Pedette said that the phrase any shortfall would need to be replaced with a specific figure, which he then stated, 7 years of annuity payments at £200 per annum. Plus the interest that would have accumulated had those payments been correctly invested on Miss Wren's behalf from the date of each quarter. Calculated at the standard chancery rate. Mr. Grieve said this figure was considerable. Mr. Pedette said it was the correct figure. There was a pause of some minutes during which Mr. Grieve consulted documents and Lord Ashworth consulted the middle distance. Isabella looked at her hands in her law. They were steady. She had been in this room before, on the day she first came with the document from the coat hem, and she had been steady then as well. She thought this was less a function of courage than of a kind of arithmetic that had become clear to her over the past 2 weeks. She had been owed this for 7 years and she had the evidence and the law was on her side, and the only remaining question was how long the other side of the table would take to reach the same arithmetic. They reached it at 11:40. The agreement was drawn up in Mr. Pedette's precise hand. The principal sum, the interest. The formal acknowledgement that Miss Wren had been the rightful beneficiary of the annuity from the date of her majority. A separate clause confirming that the original trust deed and all associated documents were to be delivered to Miss Wren directly within 5 days. Mr. Grieve said his client would like the matter kept private. Mr. Pedette looked at Isabella. She said, I have no interest in publication. I want the documents and the money. That is all. Mr. Grieve said that was satisfactory. Mr. Pedette placed the agreement in front of her, open to the signature page. With a pen, she looked at the line for a moment. Below it, in Mr. Pedette's preparatory hand, her name had been written as a guide, Isabella Catherine Wren. She had been Isabella to her cousins, when they used her name at all. She had been the girl to her aunt's acquaintances. Or Lady Ashworth's niece, which was a category rather than a name. She had been Miss Wren to Mr. Pedette and to the Duke since the beginning, which had felt, each time, like a small precise act of restoration. She had not seen all 3 names together since her father's handwriting at the bottom of the copy document. She picked up the pen, she signed her name in full, in her ordinary hand, which was clear and even and moved at the speed of someone who knows what they are writing. She put the pen down. Mr. Pedette collected the document and countersigned it and dated it and placed it in the correct folder with the efficient care of a man who has closed a great many cases and finds satisfaction in the closing. Though he would not have described it in those terms, Lord Ashworth and Mr. Grieve departed at 5 minutes past noon. Isabella remained seated for a moment after they left. The room was quiet. Through the window Lincoln's Inn Fields was doing its ordinary Tuesday business. A clerk crossing the square, a woman with a basket, 2 pigeons on the near bench conducting a negotiation about bread. Mr. Pedette said, from his position at the filing cabinet, without turning. Miss Wren, yes, your father would have found this outcome entirely satisfactory. He placed the folder in the cabinet. I did not know him well. I reviewed his Thucydides paper at the time of publication, in my capacity as a reader for the Quarterly, which your father did not know. I recommended acceptance. A pause. I had a minor objection to the conclusion, which I noted in the reader's report. She looked at the back of his head. What was your objection? That he had not pushed it far enough. Mr. Pedette said. He closed the cabinet. He turned. His face was as still as it always was. But there was something in the set of it that was not quite its professional configuration. He was right about the reconstruction. He stopped one step short of saying so. Isabella was quiet for a moment. Everyone stopped one step short. She said, "I told him to take the step. He said the paper was already written." Damar. Padette said, "Yes. I imagine he did." He came back to the table and straightened the remaining papers. "Good morning, Miss Wren. I hope we shall meet again under pleasant circumstances," she said. "I expect we shall. The Duke tells me the Crestfield Library catalogue has not been properly updated since 1790. I imagine there will be legal questions about provenance for some of the older acquisitions. That I imagine there will," Mr. Padette said. With the expression that was not a smile and occupied the same space, she went out into the square. The Duke's carriage was at the corner. She walked toward it in the May morning, in her grey dress, with her own name in her own hand on a document in Mr. Padette's filing cabinet. And the particular quality of the air when something that has been unresolved for a long time is resolved, she did not feel, as she had half expected to feel, the dramatic alteration of a person who has been transformed. She felt like herself. The same person who had stood on the library ladder on the evening of the ball, the same person who had written annotations in the margin of the Xenophon. The same person who had carried a document in a coat hem for 7 years and had not known exactly what she was keeping it for. She felt like herself, standing in Lincoln's Inn Fields on a Tuesday morning, with somewhere to go. She got into the carriage. They were married in September. At the church in the village nearest Crestfield, in a ceremony that was brief and serious and attended by the people who were actually required to attend it, the Duchess came in a carriage, wrapped in 3 shawls, and sat in the front pew and held the Countess' hand and did not, when asked later how she felt, say anything except that she was satisfied. Which was the highest register of feeling she typically expressed and which the Countess understood correctly. Lord Pembury came because Isabella had sent him the first draft of the Thucydides piece the week before and he had written back with 7 pages of commentary and the information that he intended to recommend it to the Quarterly with his strongest endorsement, and because he was the kind of man who, having formed an opinion about a person, acted on it. The Cambridge historian came because the Duke had invited him and because he was curious about the Crestfield Library, which had a documented collection of early Greek manuscripts that he had been trying to gain access to for 3 years. Cornelia sent a letter. It was 2 pages, written in a hand that was less practiced than her public manner had suggested. It said, in part, that she had been thinking about several things since the dinner at Berkeley Square, and that she was not certain she had always behaved well. And that she thought Isabella was owed an honest accounting of this even if it was late. It said that she had learned most of her Latin from Isabella's coaching and none from the governess her mother had claimed as the source, and that she had known this at the time and had not said so. And that she was sorry for it. That it was not, Isabella thought, a small thing to write. She wrote back. She and the Duke arrived at Crestfield 3 days after the wedding, in the late afternoon. When the light was going long and golden across the park and the house emerged from its surrounding trees at the last bend of the drive in the way that a house reveals itself when it has been waiting. It was large. She had expected large. But large in the abstract is different from large in front of you, with the windows catching the afternoon light and the front step slightly worn in the center from generations of feet and a gardener at the far edge of the lawn who raised a hand as the carriage passed. The housekeeper showed her tea. Rough the principal rooms. She walked through them in the manner she had developed for unfamiliar spaces, attending to everything, recording what she saw, forming no immediate conclusions. The library was on the first floor, 2 rooms knocked into one at some point in the last century, with windows on the north and east walls and shelves from floor to ceiling on the other 2 sides and a rolling ladder on a brass rail that ran the full length of the east wall. A long central table. 2 reading chairs by the north window. Angled for morning light, perhaps 20,000 volumes. She stood in the center of the room for a moment. The disorder was genuine. It was not the disorder of a collection that had been neglected but the disorder of a collection that had been actively used by several generations of people with different organizational principles, each of whom had reshelved books according to their own logic and none of whom had reconciled their logic with the previous one. There were acquisition records in a box near the door, dated intermittently from 1743 to 1812. In 7 different hands, she picked up the top record. 1786, a consignment from a Rome bookseller, 14 volumes, listed by title and approximate date of composition. The handwriting was the late Duke's. She recognized it from documents the current Duke had shown her. At the bottom of the list. In a different hand, a note, 3 of these are wrong. See attached. No attachment. She smiled. She was standing at the table with the 1786 acquisition record when the Duke came in the early evening. Having dealt with whatever required dealing with after a 3-day absence. He stopped in the doorway, she said, without looking up. Your grandfather bought 14 volumes from Rome in 1786 and someone corrected 3 of the attributions but did not preserve the correction. That would be my great-aunt. He said. She was the last person to make a serious attempt at the catalogue. She died in 1791. I will find the correction. It will be somewhere in here. She set the acquisition record down and looked at the shelves. It will take time. We have time. He said that he came to the table and set something down on it. She looked. It was a book. Small, bound in dark vellum, the spine lettered in the faded gilt of great age. A Virgil. Not the Ashworth Virgil, not a modern edition. This was older, considerably older. The kind of old that announced itself in the particular softness of the leather and the slight unevenness of the pages at the foredge. She looked at him. It came from a bookseller in Rome. He said. It took 6 months to locate. The bookseller's description mentioned marginalia in an early hand. He paused. I thought you should see it before I looked at it myself. She picked it up with the care that old books require, supporting the spine. Feeling the slight flecks of the boards. She opened it to the frontispiece. The handwriting was not hers, she knew that. Of course she knew that this book was 300 years old and her annotations were 7. But the hand was familiar in the way that a voice can be familiar before you have eyed. Typhied whose voice it is. She looked at it, then she understood that it was the same hand. The same careful deliberate formation of letters, the same slight thickening of the downstrokes. The same way the writer had of leaving a small space before a comma as if pausing to be sure of what came next. The hand of someone who had wanted the words to last. Forsen e haec olim meminus juvabit, the same phrase. Written in the same hand. Smaller here. As if the writer had been saving space, or had written it in the margin first and then copied it onto the frontispiece, wanting it in both places, perhaps one day. It will be a pleasure to remember even these things. She stood at the table in the Crestfield Library in the long evening light and held the book and was very still. The person who had written in the Ashworth Virgil had written in this one too. The same person, the same words. Separated. Bish checked the acquisition record in her memory. The gap of a dispersed collection, books sold off and scattered across a century and ending up in 2 different houses in 2 different countries and arriving, finally, at the same table. She had found the first inscription at 17. Alone in a house where she was not permitted to read, and it had meant something she could not have named then and had carried without naming for 7 years. She looked at the second inscription now, in her own library, in the evening light. With her own name on a document in Mr. Pedette's filing cabinet and 20,000 books around her in productive disorder, she thought, yes. It is. She became aware that the Duke was watching her. He had not moved from his position across the table. He was doing the thing he did. The thing she had been learning to rely on, waiting, without pressure, without filling the silence with something unnecessary. She looked up. She said, you looked for 6 months. That it seemed worth looking, he said. She set the book down on the table, carefully. And stood for a moment with her hand on the cover. Then she picked up the 1786 acquisition record and the Virgil and carried them both to the reading chair by the north window, where the last of the evening light was still sufficient, and sat down. He sat in the other chair, outside. Crestfields Park was going dark in the gradual way of September evenings. The light lasting longer than it seemed it should and then going all at once. A bird somewhere. The distant sound of the house settling into its evening quiet. She opened the Virgil to the first page of the first book. She began to read, not aloud, not yet. She was reading for herself first. Checking the quality of the text, noting where the copyist had made corrections, following the marginalia forward through the pages to see what kind of reader had owned this before the dispersal. Beside her, the Duke opened the acquisition record and began to read that. The room was quiet. The light held for a while longer. On the table between the two chairs, the small old Virgil lay open to its frontispiece, the inscription visible. Forsan haec olim meminus juvabit. Her copy of the Xenophon was on the shelf she had given it that morning, third from the left on the lower row, where she could reach it without the ladder. There were no pencil stubs in her pockets. There was a full box of them on the writing desk, next to a stack of blank paper and the first completed draft of the Thucydides piece, and she would sharpen as many as she needed, whenever she needed them, and no one would take them away.